So, good morning and a warm welcome to today's webinar from the UK Climate Resilience Programme. So, my name is Kate Lonsdale. I'm one of the two champions for the programme along with Suraj Desai, and we're based at the University of Leeds. And this webinar series was set up to communicate the findings of research funded through the UK Climate Resilience Programme. Although we now also host webinars on wider issues of relevance to climate resilience in the UK. If you're new to the programme and would like to find out more about the aims, the details of funded projects, latest news or recordings of previous webinars and newsletters, please take a look at our website, which is ukclimateresilience.org. So the timing for today, so I've got one item of news which I'll introduce, and then we'll move straight on to the main focus of today's webinar, which is climate services, standards and values. And this is based on the work of Murray Dale at JBA and a wider team, so John Doris, Consulting, Trios and others, and which has been funded by the programme. So Murray is a chartered meteorologist and technical director at JBA Consulting, and he's worked on climate projections since the turn of the century, and especially in the translation of science into practical applications. And he's worked on many public and private sector clients, both in the UK and internationally. We're then going to hear a response from Dr. Briony Turner on the relevance and value of this research to her work at Space for Climate. So she's going to be talking about climate services, standards and value from a data supply chain perspective. And Briony's worked on climate adaptation for many years now in academia, policy, practice, and in organisations that bridge between these. So like the Boundary Organisation UK Climate Impacts Programme, where she and I briefly overlapped. Briony is currently managing Space for Climate Group, the Space for Climate Group, which brings together UK-based space-enabled climate expertise and services. And she's also co-founded a networking initiative called MESH, which encourages people working on climate services to connect. We should then have around 15 to 20 minutes for questions and discussion, and which you can address to either Briony or to Murray, and then we'll end at 1 o'clock. So we encourage you to ask questions, and we're using the Q&A function for questions rather than the chat. So please add questions as they occur to you throughout the presentations. You don't have to wait until the end. We also encourage you to upvote other people's questions that you particularly like to hear answered. As participants, you will remain muted unless I unmute you. The webinar audio and the slides will be shared a couple of days after the event, and will also be available through the YouTube link on our website. If you have any tech problems, please use the chat and we'll do our best to help you. And just to remind you, the webinar is being recorded. So yeah, just one item of news from the Climate Change Committee. So the Climate Change Committee will be launching their third Climate Change Risk Assessment Evidence Report on the 16th of June. So this is the sort of comprehensive view of the UK climate change to inform the government's third UK CCRA assessment, so the CCRA3 government report, and then the next UK and devolved national adaptation plans. So that's part of the 5-yearly requirement set in motion by the Climate Change Act. So this is the result of more than 3 years of work with input from 450 experts from over 130 organisations, and the Climate Change Committee are hosting a webinar to launch the report. That's where you can hear sort of what the report says, so what the latest scientific evidence, also information about cost implications and the priorities for the next 5 years. And then on the 24th of June, the Committee on Climate Change, the Climate Change Committee will publish its 2021 progress report to Parliament. So this will include both the annual assessment of UK progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and also an assessment of UK progress to preparing for climate change. And all of this information, so the evidence report, will be hosted on the UK Climate Risk website, so that's ukclimaterisk.org. So let's move on to the focus of today's webinar. And I'm now going to hand over to Murray, who's going to tell us about climate services, standards and value. Over to you, Murray.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate. I'll bring up my slides. Great. Well, thanks a lot for the introduction. This is a project that's as part of the UK Climate Resilience Programme set of projects. There's a group of these projects under the Strategic Priorities Fund, SPF projects that are administered by the Met Office, and this is one of these. So we are working directly with our Met Office programme board, who are supervising us and providing advice as we go through. So this project is one of quite a few projects that you can see in the UK Climate Resilience Programme website. This is this one here. So if you go to the project list, you'll be able to find details about all these projects which are ongoing. What I'm going to talk about is the premise for why the project is existing, then provide a definition of climate services that we're using in the project, because that's quite important, and it also can be somewhat contentious in the sense that there's different views on what that definition should be. I'll then talk about where we've got to so far. So this is a 2-year project that started in October last year and will carry on till October next year, 22. We've currently completed the scoping stage of this project and are engaging in the main stage at the moment. I'll mention the future plans and opportunities for people who may wish to be engaged in the project who may not be already. And then I'll pass over to Briony, who's going to make a response from the stakeholder perspective. This is the premise for the project. There's quite a few words on this slide, but if you forgive me, I'd like to read them out just so that we get all that information out. And these slides will be available so that this can provide a record if people need to refer back. Climate services are a critical component of adaptation, and that's a statement that comes out of a paper by Jim Hansen and others, which is a very good paper. I'd recommend anyone reading if they're interested in this subject. Within this paper and within the brief for the project, we're aware that decision makers are often dependent on the insight of specialist climate service providers to understand their hazards, vulnerabilities and exposure, and then to turn that understanding into effective action. So decision making is a key element of this project. A well-functioning climate service can help society to be more resilient to current and future climate threats. So it's not just about future climate change and adaptation to that, it's also about climate services that may be using observation data or maybe shorter future term, if you like, so seasonal forecasts, but I'll touch on those timeframes shortly. As yet, there is no standard for climate services, and that's what this project is aiming to address, developing a standard or a standards framework that climate services can sit within to benefit both the users of these services, but also those people who are providing the services. There's also increasing interest in monitoring and valuing climate services. Investing in climate services leads to improved information, which can in turn provide economic, environmental, and societal benefits to users as they lead to positive outcomes from the actions and decisions taken. So there is an element within our project that is looking at how to both monitor and value climate services. And that work is going on in tandem with the standards development. Central to the project's approach is a focus on the user as well as the provider of the climate service. And a lot of what we've been doing in the last few months has been engaging with stakeholders who may be either users or providers, or sometimes both, of climate services, so that we can make sure they are involved from the outset and have a core group with which we can engage to make the standards as effective as possible. The climate services standards need to facilitate and support user needs, effectively engaging the user within their current capacity, whether they be a novice or deeply experienced. So as we'll look on in a little bit, there's more than one size fits all for this form of standard. There are users who may have some information, may have very little information, or maybe very educated in climate science and require specialist information. So there's quite a range of user needs and a range of provider experience as well. If we then think about what climate services are, we're using a definition that's in bold text at the top of this page. And this says that climate services involve the production, translation, transfer and use of climate knowledge and information in climate-informed decision-making, with this decision-making element being a key part of this. So it's information production that has been post-processed to a degree that can be then used to inform a decision about something you might want to do. So there are some example questions at the bottom that's in an image that's been adapted from a WMO report about things like how will temperature affect UK disease patterns, when will I be able to consider new crop types, etc. There are other definitions of climate services. The second one uses this term climate smart decisions. I'm personally don't understand what that means, but I'll be welcome to hear if anyone can give me information on that. There are also the last example here is talking about the fact that services need to be timely and tailored to suit decision makers' needs. So those are elements that are important to us. It's not just about the quality of the climate service, it's also about how that service is delivered, how reliable it is, whether it's freely available, for example, and how you can access it. Another element of defining climate services for this project is to say which climate services are we talking about in terms of the temporal scales. So we're looking at climate services for present day risks and opportunities that are based on observations. So that's historic data and other measured information that have been collected already from the climate that has existed and exists up to now. Then we're looking into the future in terms of seasonal risks and opportunities that are based on climate and weather projections. And those are typically seasonal forecasts that might be something like 3 to 6 months ahead. And also climate services for the long-term risks and opportunities. So based on climate model projections into the 21st century and beyond. But the typical sort of adaptation related services. So one part of climate services that are not in scope is weather forecasts and short-range weather forecasting related services. We have a fairly broad delivery team on this project. So as Kate mentioned, John Dora and a team from Climate Sense is involved. They formerly had a company name of Trios, but Climate Sense is a new name for that group, and they've got a lot of experience in standards development and were heavily involved in the recent ISO 14090 climate adaptation standard. Paul Watkis and a group from that he's working with are leading the work related to the valuing and monitoring of climate services. And I'll mention a bit about that as we go on. We've also got Becky Venton and Rob will be advising us, and Rob Lamb, And importantly, on the left side are the stakeholder groups that we are engaging with, including other SPF teams and other SPF projects, and all of you who are interested in this work. So as I mentioned, one of the key focuses of our attention in the last few weeks and months has been assembling stakeholder groups. We invited, I think it was about 70 people to see whether they wanted to be engaged and involved in this project. And this has resulted in us collating 3 groups of stakeholders. The sort of central core group, who are helping to develop the standard by offering text, attending meetings and discussion engagement sessions. So we had one of those in April, just gone. Then there's a group who are keen to be consulted about how the standard is progressing as we go through the next 12 to 15 months. And also another group who are keen to be staying informed about how close, how this standard is progressing and the rest of the project. In that central group helping to develop the standard, we've got this list of organizations. So it's quite a broad range, and it includes people who are both users and providers of climate services. In the being consulted and kept informed groups, we have these organizations. So that's helped to support the spread of organizations we had in the previous from that central group. So we've got a range of people involved in infrastructure, natural environment, health, for example, a number of the CCRA risks, as well as groups who are involved in developing climate services from who might be academics or in an academic organization or consultancies, for example. Now, in April, we held an engagement event with the central core group, and this is a summary of the output of that workshop or engagement event, we called it. We posed this group of people 2 questions. How should the standard consider the interface between climate service users and providers? And what would encourage use of this standard? So we got some useful discussion and information out of these, out of that event, and they're captured in these 2 tables. I won't read them all out now. You'll be maybe pleased to hear, but they cover themes on the left side of service delivery and accessibility, quality, the user-provider interaction, and how the standard might be used, and then about encouraging use, considerations of its usability and relevance, the freedom to access it, also the quality aspects, but also things like reputation and the expectations of what people may expect in the future. Will this climate service be accredited to a specific standard? Degrees of publicity and how it's developed in the future. So there's information there that may be useful if you want to see these slides at a later date, but that information has been useful and is being taken forward into an early draft of the climate services standards. This is a proposal document that's been developed by colleagues at Climate Sense, John Dora and Doogie Black and Nick Pyatt, and with going through internal review within our team, this has evolved somewhat. So this is the version that was released in April, and it's got headings that you can maybe see there, but covering aspects to do with quality, levels of user experience and maturity, if you like, with the term maturity needs to be defined. And as you can see, part 4 is looking at accreditation and how that might go ahead in the future. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions with this standard and how this will evolve. The idea being that we'll have a working draft, a first working draft of this standard developed later this summer, and then 2 more working drafts as we go through the autumn, winter, and into new year, that help refine this standard. And one of the key things we're keen on is part 5, looking at case studies. So it will be very useful to demonstrate with existing climate services how they fit within a standard like this. So we can, if you like, dry run or test this standard against existing services and give some information for people who are maybe developing new services to be able to understand, well, this was how it works with a service that might be similar to ours. I mentioned then also that with the project's looking at a methodology for valuing and monitoring climate services. So a report's been produced that sets out a range of possible options for how you can value climate services. And this report was led by Paul Watkis and his colleagues. It sets out these approaches. It's still being finalized, this particular document. And following this, there will be 3 case studies that the project will follow that will look at the 3 time scales I mentioned earlier. So historical or observation-based services, seasonal forecast services, and longer range adaptation services. There are particular challenges with this. It's certainly easiest to develop valuation approaches for seasonal forecast services, but it's somewhat more difficult to come up with valuation methods for the other 2 timeframes, particularly the future one. That's not to say that we don't want to try and do it, but it does present some challenges which we're looking at how are ways to address. So what do we want to get out of it? Well, there are 2 principal outcomes from the project. A standard framework for providing quality assurance for users and providers of services, so people have confidence in a specific climate service, can compare that service with other climate services, and also this tested approach for valuing and monitoring climate services. Those are the 2 principal outcomes, and the project will be working towards developing those. Where are we going from now? Well, here's the standard Gantt chart you may have seen on other projects. We are currently in this middle phase in June, working into July, where we've gone through our scoping phase. We've established a stakeholder engagement group and series of groups, and we've developed this initial version of the standard, and also developed the initial monitoring and valuing proposal. Our next engagement event is scheduled for the 14th of July, and we've got a number of people signed up to that so far. There we'll be discussing the climate services standard framework that's been put forward so far, and looking forward to some interesting discussions around that. Following that, we'll be having 2 further working drafts, which are scheduled for the latter half of 21 and into 22, and also working on these case studies for the monitoring and valuing work. There'll be a workshop and dissemination event at the end of the project, currently scheduled for next October, some way away yet, but we'll be able to update this information on the project website. If you're keen to be involved, we'd like to hear from you. Stakeholder groups have published, but if you're a climate service user or provider and you'd like to be involved in helping to develop the standard or being consulted on it or simply being kept informed, please do send your details in an email explaining reason for your interest. And if you could send it to my colleague Rachel Nye at JBA, that's her email address, pronounced Rachel rather than Rachel. She's working with me on this project and will be happy to collate your information. We do need to keep the groups to a manageable size, but we are keen to hear from people who are keen to join. So lastly, the intended project benefits. I've mentioned that those two key outcomes, but these are the benefits spelled out in a little bit more detail. Climate service users should feel confident that a climate service user group has fed into a new standards framework, and this can enable more effective and informed decision making because those users feel they have increased confidence in that service. Providers will have an approved national standards framework to use when developing new services or measuring existing services against. Related to the valuing part of the project, service providers can benefit commercially by demonstrating that their services are meeting national standards. Climate services users and providers also have this important information on the value of climate services that have been tested through the application of case studies. So those are our intended benefits, but we'd be certainly happy to explain or talk about those if that's of interest. So if that's okay, I'll hand over to Briony and I'll drive the slides. Briony, if you're able to unmute, and I can try and mute myself.
Super. Just checking, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, thanks.
Okay, great. So if you can move on to the title slide, I think we're ready to start. Good morning, everyone. Brilliant to be with you. And Space for Climate Group was felt very privileged to be asked to take part in this particular seminar and to provide a kind of response from the space sector really on this. First of all, I'd like to say that we welcome the work led by UKRI Climate Resilience Programme and the Met Office on this, and we welcome this project, and we've been involved as stakeholders, and I think in some of the events like the event on sort of a code of ethics for climate services that University of Leeds ran last year, which I think have sort of built into this. So first and foremost, we really welcome this. And we have already some of the points I'm going to raise today have been fed in, but I think they sort of need to be considered a wider discussion. And whilst I'll talk from the space sector perspective and our data supply chain, those of you listening today that are involved with all sorts of different types of data sets involved in climate services, I think this is really a chance to turn and think about the data supply chain and how that works within a climate services standard framework. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So I'll just provide a short brief overview about the Space for Climate Group, because I'm sure for many of you actually you might not have come across us, and that's partly my job to raise the profile of the group. So the Space for Climate Group represents UK expertise and capability in climate satellite data. We're chaired by the UK Space Agency, and we span government, industry, academia and the third sector. We are a boundary organisation. I came to Space for Climate having worked in the UK Climate Impacts Programme. And I think these boundary organisations are really, really important. Space for Climate is also a member of the London Climate Change Partnership, one of the sort of longest existing partnerships in the UK. So our members have expertise in the development of the sensors, the building of the satellites, the getting them up into space that can observe Earth and give us information about the state of our planet. We have expertise in analysis and exploitation of that data, and we have expertise in the production of quality assured global data and climate services deriving from those climate data sets. The group connects UK producers with global users of trusted Earth observation data, and actionable climate analytics and services to respond to rapidly emerging needs, and also to develop new opportunities and collaborations. And do approach me if there's an idea you have and you'd like to touch base with the UK space sector in this area. The UK space sector genuinely is at the forefront of global efforts to create and use trusted satellite data for climate action for all. And if you can go to the next slide, please. The way in which Space for Climate operates, there's a lot of sort of coordination of the group, but I think the bit of interest in relation to climate standards are our task groups, where we actually bring together members at different parts of the supply chain with external members interested in using satellite data, perhaps combining it with all sorts of other data sets. There's one not on there, a peatlands one, which is very active at the moment. And then we sometimes repurpose existing capabilities to actually build a service that's actually going to meet user requirements. And in experimenting in those development of sort of user-driven services, we then look at, well, what are the professional implications, what are the certification and quality assurance implications, and how can we go about doing this? So I've just given an example on the right, just to make this a bit more real before going into climate satellite data, that even in existing kind of types of products we have, there are climate indexes. Those in themselves are a climate service. Those are used, particularly assurance agencies really like using those. I've got the example there, the Telespazio Extreme Rainfall Explorer. You can go right down to one particular variable that's really, really important for different organizations. Sometimes they like to draw that data in via an API or other means, and then the organization is then creating its own climate service on top of that, which is already processed data set that's been turned into an information service to meet their needs. And then there's something far more complex. You can build more complex decision support tools like the assets at flood risk. I've got there the Eco Actuary tool. Next slide, please. So this is just to mention, among the other things that we do host networks, and Mesh was mentioned. And for anyone that's listening to this, you probably do have a role, if you're based in the UK, in using or producing climate information. We really encourage you to join the Mesh network. We are about to launch a series of regional networking events, and as the standard goes through its process, we really hope we can offer up the community for further stakeholder engagement and dissemination from this project. I should also mention we also host a network, an air quality network, which some of you might be interested in. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before, next slide, please. Yeah, super. The UK has a really, really strong satellite basis, and that's leadership in sort of climate satellite data, and that largely comes from our scientists working with industry to deliver on these. So what you can see in front of you is a group of the European Space Agency's Climate Change Initiative Essential Climate Variables. Essential climate variables provide the empirical evidence to support climate science and also to better predict future change. And they can also be used, and we're exploring how they can be used, particularly like land surface, the data set I'm at the moment, to guide mitigation and climate adaptation measures, also how they can be used to assess climate risks, to attribute climatic events to underlying causes, and to support other climate services being developed. But primarily, they've been developed from a scientific basis to help underpin the work of the UNFCCC and the Global Climate Observing System. So what we've got is scientific expertise. We've got data sets that span 30, sometimes more years, climatic data sets. And these are not all the essential climate variables. There are, I think, 26. But as you can see, the UK is leading or involved in the vast majority. So we have fantastic scientific satellite climate expertise here. I should also mention that the Met Office is the lead contractor for the CCI climate modelling user group, and assesses the essential climate variables consistency, and also looks at how this can be used to improve projections. So that was just to establish we have a really, really strong scientific basis, and that's just our Earth observation scientists working on the CCI programme. Beyond that, and there'll be some listening to today, there will be many scientists in engineering, geology, geography, geospatial environmental change, conservation, built environment, public health departments across the country actually using these data sets, perhaps as one tiny variable, or the information from them, to actually create climate information decision support tools and conduct their analysis. Please could go to next slide, please. So here is our version of what we consider climate services. I think when you saw the original definition, you sort of included the production of data, and we really think this is important. This is what I want to sort of bring the message home in creating climate services sort of standards, is that we, certainly with the satellite data, we need the visionaries today working and innovating on new sensors that then can go up, that will provide in a decade's time, new types of scientific and robust climate information that we can all use to inform our services. Then we have the data set collation and platform. So the satellite data is petabytes of data, and none of you would be able to work, or very few of you, if you're working at CEDA, you would be able to work with those petabytes of data. So there's a huge amount of skill, expertise, data processing and data infrastructure to actually turn those petabytes of data into even just basic data information products that have been quality assured, that then can go in and use, on the right, you'll see the value added services. Just to give you just a bit of an example, I should just mention the mission that's pictured there is the microcarb satellite, which is a joint French-UK mission, which will measure atmospheric carbon dioxide within 0.3%, representing one of the most accurate measurements of atmospheric concentrations from space to date. And it will have a city sweep mode. So there's really exciting things happening with satellite data, not just those climate records I showed you, but the new types of data we're going to start having to build up the climate data records of today and tomorrow. And then to the far end, the value added services, I've just drawn on two projects from the Space Agency's International Partnership Programme, RESAT, which is developed by the Institute for Environmental Analytics, and that's an energy analytics programme developed up for supporting SIDS, small island developing states. So it uses, in amongst other data sets, satellite data sets, and this enables them to provide resource maps, including solar maps, wind maps, wave maps, ocean thermal maps. Then they have an energy scenario builder to allow decision-makers to explore and identify the best renewable energy mix, and support also planning where to locate assets to avoid protected areas. And then also assessment of financial viability and investment potential, and enabling collaboration around it. So there's some really, really sophisticated climate service products out there already using climate satellite data. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what you've got here is, I just wanted to reveal a little bit of that data processing supply chain, and that I think the data supply chains providing the climate data are really important to include in thinking about the valuation of climate services, and indeed in thinking about particularly if you're looking at what types of professions you're going to accredit or organizations, not forgetting about what is actually quite invisible, the data supply chain. At the moment to date, largely the climate data supply chain, I would say, is invisible because it's had huge amounts of public sector funding in it to establish it, and definitely when it comes to the space sector, that's true. So what you're seeing here is how you get from the petabytes of data from the satellites as part of the European Space Agency program of work, through to the information in kilobytes that's then available on the climate data store via the Copernicus system for you to access. They also on that store have developed visualization tools and some basic analysis tools as well, to enable you to actually just draw out the information that you want, rather than having to mine through. And then they have API tools and things like that. So in some ways, the space sector is incredibly sophisticated in where it's got to already, with demonstrators to show how you can turn that satellite climate data into services. If you could just click again, hopefully the animations, there's an animation that comes through. But what I wanted to really make the point on this about is that there's cost and skill involved in creating and sustaining that. And often the public sector will fund kicking it off. But the minute that there's a commercial market in place, they'll be expecting the commercial sector, particularly when we're in a post-COVID world where there is immense need for public sector investment in all sorts of other areas of economic recovery. They're going to be expecting the commercial world to be paying their fair share if they're relying on those data sets. So I think when we're thinking about modeling climate services and thinking about things like also carbon trading, quality assurance, we should be costing in the data supply chain and the sustainment of it for commercial services, because what governments around the world might choose to do to sustain data for the scientific effort, for the monitoring of how our Earth is coping with our efforts to mitigate climate change and adapt to it, those decisions might not be the same. They might not prioritize sustainment of the same data sets that the commercial services are using. And when you're going from having a sort of data product to a service, sustainment, access and data quality are incredibly important. And those things actually need to start being valued in, not valued out. Could we have the next slide, please? So Space for Climate actually realised this quite a long time ago. So I joined in 2017. By 2018, we'd set up a competent persons task group because we realised that outside of our sort of group of experts that proportionally are really quite small, if we wanted the world to be exploiting using this climate data and all this hard work that had gone into the quality assurance and robustness of it, then we needed to see how could we join other professions and provide them with training, CPD, so that they could be confident in using Earth observation data, not just in its own right, but also combining it with other data sets and understanding how to treat, particularly dealing with different uncertainties, to create a product that's going to be used by decision makers. And so we set up this task group to investigate and report on pragmatic routes to do that. And we were really quite surprised. We ran interviews, we'd approached 18 professional bodies, and we ended up within the time frame being able to speak to 10 across the environmental, geographic, meteorology and physics and engineering domains. And we were really surprised at the time that whilst there was a growing recognition that quality of climate services is an issue that needs to be addressed, most of the professional frameworks were really focused on general competencies, and they might have a technical part, but they would sort of refer to data analysis, but wouldn't be specific on the types of climate data sets. And many of the professional bodies we interviewed as part of their awards of chartered status did not explicitly include the skills and knowledge necessary for the provision of climate services. And the exception to that was our METSOC, which had an existing provision for the assessment and acknowledgement of Earth observation skills and knowledge and handling of climate data. And I think the other thing that when we were having those discussions with professional bodies was worth highlighting relevant to the standard was that they indicated that data analysis skills and the assurance to act ethically were a way to address the topic. And that's why we really looked to the professional bodies, because of that sort of ethical guidance, which we think is incredibly important in any kind of standard for climate services. So most professional bodies at the end of our work, we found, had no plans for specific inclusion of climate Earth observation data or services in their competency assessments. But they all said that they would respond if they detected a need in their membership or their community, and many would recommend and welcome CPD relevant sessions. So we were sort of left where we'd wanted to bring in our data sets in a professional way into the professionalization of climate services as we saw it, and found that actually the professionalization of climate services wasn't quite there at all. And so we sort of analysed this, and we felt at the end of this that whilst we can look at accreditation of individuals, and I think we'll be really interested to see particularly how our METSOC proceeds with the sort of competent persons type approach. What this won't do is directly address the assessment of data quality nor uncertainties. Instead, you're making the professional responsible for their analyses, their advice and their services. So we think this is a really hard to tackle part of the standard, which we're really keen to work with the standard project organisers on to try and tackle. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to finish up here with something we're doing now. So we're working with one of our members, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. They work in country, they're part of the UN family. We're at the moment in the middle of a joint program of work with them to investigate how partnerships can unlock increased cooperation along the value chain of data-driven climate action, so that data systems are appropriate and inclusive by design, hopefully to minimize needing to have ethical dilemmas later on, because we get the inclusivity right at the beginning. Now, the reason I'm bringing that up in relation to the data standards, that inclusive data systems and services are not just ethical, but they make business sense. And we really already finding they've, so GPSDD have interviewed a number of stakeholders that are working with Earth observation derived services and data sets, and they include consulting with the Geo-Indigenous Alliance, where you're combining Indigenous knowledge with satellite data as an example, and other data sets. What we're finding, and this is kind of why I want to make this point, is that it's not just accredited individuals, it's not just finding ways maybe to give some kind of quality assurance for what organizations are doing. There's so many different ways you can look at standards and competencies. But we also think within climate services in particular, that we actually need to recognize the role of the brokerage partnerships between government and technical experts around the world that are bridging the demand for climate data solutions and expertise. And it's applied particularly whilst the climate services marketplace is so early on. We need to learn the lessons and value in rather than value out the climate data supply chain. And we need to make sure that the ethical dimensions and inclusivity are brought into that standard and provider framework. We'll be running in London Climate Action Week a closed session. If you're interested in joining us, please contact me. 29th of June, where we'll be presenting the main findings. And then what we hope will come out of this project, I can see Kate coming on, so I am wrapping up, will be a framework for partnership brokers to effectively and efficiently evaluate the appropriateness of data solutions, and a set of key must-dos for ensuring responsible partnership brokering that is inclusive by design. And we welcome bringing this learning and framework into the consideration around an appropriate standard for climate services. And so last slide, I think, is the contact slide. I think the last thing I'd just add is that having been myself, I'm part of IEMA, I'm a member of many professional bodies. You end up in a knowledge broker, you end up stuck, don't you, a little bit. So I would welcome professionalization of climate services from my own sort of sporadic approach to having a professional qualification. But I am an IEMA member, and I would be really interested to see how the standard for climate services can work and interact with existing professionalization of the environmental sector, of environmental impact assessments, of environmental, social and corporate governance, and also with the ISO standards as well. You cannot have sustainability if you're not thinking about the role of climate, and we have to be careful in professionalizing climate services that we don't make it end up being something distinct from sustainability and work on environmental social governance. It's actually a crucial part of that jigsaw. So thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to the questions.
Great, many thanks, Briony, and also Murray. It's great to hear the progress that's already been made in the project, and also hear from Space for Climate. Clearly, there are a number of quite difficult issues around trying to develop a standard. We've got a question here about, so you talked about what users want: timely, reliable, cost-effective, accessible services. But you also talk about quite a lot about quality and quality assurance processes. So there's a question here about, does your conceptualization of quality take value judgments into account, or perhaps there's a request to expand a little on how you are viewing quality in this context. So is that something you could kick off, Murray, and then I'll come to you, Briony?
It's a work in progress, I think, is the short answer. I think one of the aspects related to quality, and in the detail I did see the question and went through the standard framework as it stands, is that I think we're looking at ways in which we can quantify and measure elements of quality rather than have things that are more subjective. So we're trying to see whether, I think the proposal is to use a quality index that comprises a number of sort of subheadings, so that you can assess a quality level in a set of categories that might be related to, for example, how a service treats uncertainty in climate projections, or the complexity of the data used, for example. So there are ways in which our team who are developing the standards are trying to keep this such that we can have measurable indicators related to quality. But it's certainly a work in progress, and we want to get feedback into this. And if the person asking the question was keen to join us, we'll be keen to help hear what she has to say.
Okay, great. Briony, do you have some thoughts on quality?
Yes, this is a really interesting one. So our members, of course, there's work on the climate data sets themselves, and they go through, or the ones that our members are, and that we're sort of promoting use of quality and evaluation processes, and there's metadata, etc. But the question was about the kind of value judgment of using that. So I think it's a bit of a jigsaw that needs to come together, that several things need to be done at the same time. I actually think we need traceability and certification, where actually show how data has been processed all the way along, has been treated. So there's a transparent and consistent methodology, and that's not just in an individual data set, but where that climate service has brought together those. So you've got a really traceable kind of certificate of how that data has been treated. Then I also think that you do need accredited professionals that could go in, and because most organizations will not want to reveal, they want black box for their algorithms or however they've developed their point to get time information that decision makers using. So I think there needs to be competent persons. I do think there needs to be assessors like we have for ISO 14001, that type of thing. But then in terms of the question about the value judgments, the thing is that you can't make a value judgment unless you've got that clear, traceable information. And something I didn't mention because I sort of skipped over, but I was going to talk about the task force on climate related risk disclosure. They've recently done a consultation of those that are already voluntary reporting. And when I looked at on metrics, and 73% of the respondents indicated that they needed better availability and quality of greenhouse gas emission data. I was just picking up on that. And also that it was really important that they wanted greater clarity and transparency in calculation methodologies. So if they had that, they would then be able to be better placed to make a value judgment. And I think if we combine that with the kind of framing I'm talking about with the Global Partnership for Sustainable Data Development, about evaluating whether the solutions designed is fit for purpose if you're taking something global to a particular local context, that's part of the climate service provision to make that value judgment. But to make that value judgment, really, you need the professional accredited jigsaw bits there so that your value judgment can be really traceable and accountable. And I also think the other thing I'd add that came out of the climate ethics workshop that I know that Gillian was really fundamental in organising, it was so important, was do we need to have a bit of a sounding panel for ethical dilemmas on value judgments to help learn rather than say that we are an expert in a particular thing and this is a value judgment made as an expert. I think we could actually say we're not experts, we're learning, particularly on interventions for adaptation.
Thank you. Thank you both. I'd like to get a sense of who do you think, I mean, do you feel like that you're really pushing the field on this, or is this something that, or who do you think, what other countries or what other initiatives are doing this well already that you're kind of learning from, or who inspires you in this area? Marie, do you want to have a start at that?
Well, it does appear that this isn't. It is of interest internationally, and there was a paper in 2015 setting out that there was a requirement for standards in climate services, but as far as we're aware, that nothing has happened since then to actually develop national or international standards. So it does seem that it's a new area, and it's, of course, with new things, it's fraught with challenges, because we're trying to feel our way, and just working out which climate services we're dealing with is part of the challenge. So yeah, I think UK is leading the way in some regard in this, because certainly people like Chris Hewitt, who's involved in this project from the Met Office, sits on the panels in WMO that are I think he actually leads a group in WMO on climate service provision. So I think people like him are trying to push this forward as much as possible. And there is a hope that this standard, once developed and acceptable in the UK, could become useful internationally and developed for other countries.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Briony, who inspires you in this area?
I must say that working with GPSDD, also seeing what the UN Environment Programme, and also the Group on Earth Observations, particularly their Indigenous Alliance work. What I was actually going to say before I just went into those groups was just that, having been around the block with UK Climate Impacts Programme and a lot of work internationally that's gone on in climate change, I think what it is that, as I understand, it's the first time we're kind of bringing the tacit knowledge and expertise of people that have been working actually quite a long time in climate change adaptation and mitigation, to actually look at how can we set a kind of standard and a frame of professionalization. So I do think that the best practice is already out there, particularly in the brokerage organizations that can have that longer institutional memory of what's worked, what hasn't. There's huge amounts that's been done in the climate change adaptation world, as you well know, Kate, on evaluation and learning. So I think it's a question of being able to bring that in and then test the standard against known existing climate services that have been going actually for 5, 10 years, some of them. And we've got some of those sort of knowledgeable, experienced experts I know involved in this. I think what I would say with working with GPSDD and GEO, and that is, what I see is, having gone to many ECHA conferences and Adaptation Futures, which happens every 2 years, that's at the moment where we've really had that sharing of the knowledge, which now we're trying to put a more of a professional stamp on. But always what was missing actually was the data supply chain. And when Space for Climate went in 2018 to Adaptation Futures, we were the only data stand sort of there. So I think that there's lots that has already been done, but I think this work that for those of you that don't know, the World Meteorological Organization has I always get the acronym around the wrong way, so correct me, but Global Climate Services Framework. Chris Hewitt's involved with that. I think, bringing in that sort of robust meteorology, that kind of data side in with the tacit knowledge and experience now of climate services actually having been delivered over the last 10, 20 years. We have to remember in the UK that we've had quite a quiet period. Things were building up, we were doing very exciting things and we had our Climate Change Act in 2008, and then there was a lot of dismantling of climate change partnership and investment in, but the world was cracking on with climate services, and under schemes like the International Partnering Programme, the Space Agency have funded, and GCRSE, there's been exciting things. So I'm inspired by, I would say, particularly those brokerage international partnerships, because they know where the complexity points are, where the traction is, and that's what you want a standards framework to help you with as a professional, to help provide some consistent guidance. So
great. Okay, thanks. And probably this is the last question. We're obviously a research program. So how do you think research can best support the development of this standard? What kind of things could it be doing? I mean, it's so much about, this very close engagement with users. That's the critical part. So what is the role of research in supporting this kind of work?
Well, we're very keen that researchers who are developing climate services are engaged. There's two sides to the puzzle. The users know what they want. They want to make decisions about whether it's flood risk or water resources or overheating, and they know the type of services that they want and need, or generally they do. They want confidence in those services. But we're really keen to hear from those researchers who are interested in or have already produced climate services themselves, which are being used, to make sure that we're not trying to impose a challenging standard on people that makes life difficult. We're trying to make sure climate services providers feel that this standard helps them because what they're doing fits into a framework that makes sense. So it's the research community is very important to this project. We're pleased that we've got some good input at the moment already, but if there are others who are keen to be involved, we'd like to hear from them.
Okay.
I was just going to say that as part of the workshops we've been involved with GPSDD, looking at the inclusivity issue, we've really reached out to ethical researchers across the world, particularly when you're bringing in data sets like you can get mobility data from mobile phones and things like that, combined with socioeconomic data sets, etc. And I think researchers, particularly in the field of the kind of ethical dimensions, the socioeconomic data sets, and what constitutes a value decision, I think if we could have those in, as well as the researchers that are working from a data standards, traceability, and quality assurance. And I think the last thing I'd say is those researchers that are out there working and bringing together multiple different types of data sets with different types of uncertainty, both social, economic, and physical meteorological climate data sets. I think those are the researchers we would really, really value hearing that this standard can help with that complexity, because that's, if you start looking at net zero adaptation solutions, which is what we should be looking at, we shouldn't be having just a race to resilience, a race to net zero. What we need a net zero adaptation solutions. You start working with extremely complex data sets, and that's actually where a standard and a framework can really, really help for climate services.
Brilliant, thank you, Briony. So yeah, and many thanks to both our speakers. We've come to the end of the session today, and thanks for the questions. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. So it just remains for me to say that, to give a quick plug for the future webinars in the series. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to be hearing from Richard Pywell from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. He's going to be talking about the work he's done with CropNet, so looking at monitoring and predicting the effects of climate change on crop yields. And then 2 weeks again after that, after the launch of the evidence report for the climate change risk assessment, we'll be hearing from the person that led that, Richard Betts, and also from Catherine Brown from the Climate Change Committee on the findings of the CCRA evidence report. So many thanks again to Murray and to Briony on behalf of the Champion team for all your insights, and for everybody for attending. I hope you enjoyed it. Goodbye.